Hello everyone, welcome to my lesson. So I welcome my students from the groups 5 to 8 English speaking groups. Well, glad to see you again. Today we'll develop our previous question, and the new question for today, the topic that we plan to discuss is the aggregate demand and aggregate supply and interactions of aggregate demand and aggregate supply. But before starting, I would like to remind you the questions that we discussed within the topic known like business cycle. So business cycle, as you know, implies the time to time repeated ups and downs in economic activity, or in other words, the economic fluctuations in business activity. That's why the economists decided to analyze the new approach, and this new approach is the model of economic fluctuations. So this model implies to analyze two important variables, and these variables are used to develop this model in order to analyze the short-run fluctuations. What are these two important variables? First one, that is the economist output. And the second one, of course, is the overall price level. The economist output, normally we measure in terms of real GDP, and the overall price level is measured by means of normally consumer price index or GDP deflator. Now let's turn to aggregate demand and aggregate supply. So in order to distinguish among the two variables important for construction and forming the model of economic fluctuations, in economic world, economists and specialists offer to use two different models. The first one is aggregate demand. This is the first approach, and the second one is aggregate supply. So why do we need this? We need this to explain the periodically repeated short-run fluctuations in economic activity in the country within the frames of the single country, and to develop this model to the further possible changes in economic activity in order to form the long-run economic trend. Okay, that's why, firstly, we have to define what do we mean when we say aggregate demand, and why we can associate the aggregate demand with aggregate demand curve. First reason is that actually we have some information from the previous experience. I mean, we know a lot of facts concerning the demand. What is new for this term? Just new what? Aggregate. So we have to fill the differences among the simple demand at the level of macroeconomic investigation, and aggregate demand, because now we try to study macroeconomics. So perhaps we can guess that maybe aggregate demand and in turn aggregate demand curve shows the quality of goods and services that different economic agents, and namely, what are these different economic agents? Firstly, firms, households, different companies, enterprises, and of course the government. So they want to produce specific level of goods and services at each price level. So summarizing all of this, we may assert that aggregate demand and as well as the aggregate demand curve, because the difference between them is so negligible. Actually, the second one, curve, is just visualizing the aggregate demand. And they show the quantity of goods and services that all households, all enterprises, all companies, all corporations, all firms, absolutely all economic agents, and of course the government, they want to buy at each price level. So that is the total amount of goods and services offered for the different economic agents in order they can purchase them. So that is the aggregate demand. If you remember, in microeconomics, we identify demand as willingness and ability of separate individual customers or consumers to buy specific amount of goods and services at each price level. So it's definitely was the individual demand, and this demand at macroeconomic level is identified for single product or single service. In contrast, at macroeconomic level, we talk about the total amount of goods and services offered at the specific price level in order the different economic agents may buy them. Well, go further. Okay, so the second approach of this economic modal fluctuations is aggregate supply. Well, aggregate supply, again, I would like to remind you the definition of supply at microeconomic level, because we always have to compare them in order to understand the differences. Well, at microeconomic level, supply implies the willingness and ability of producers, or simply saying sellers, to sell different goods and services at specific price imposed by the market conditions. Well, and again, that was individual supply. So individual willingness, ability of some individual producer or seller. In case of macroeconomics, when we try to understand the aggregate demand, and of course the visual representation of aggregate supply, it means the aggregate supply curve, we have very clearly understand what kind of concept we want to include in content of aggregate supply. So the aggregate supply is specific macroeconomic conception that tries to show the quantity of goods and services that all firms available in the market at macroeconomic level produce and sell at specific price level, again offered and dictated by the market conditions. Okay, now go to the interactions. Well, perhaps you have to be familiar with this similar scheme. If you remember, we analyzed the similar schematic approach at macroeconomic level when we tried to explain the market equilibrium, or the equilibrium in terms of demand and supply interaction. So in macroeconomics, we asserted that the macroeconomic equilibrium is a result of intersection of demand and supply curves. And as a result, at intersection point, we see the equilibrium. And this equilibrium offers two parameters. The first parameter is the price of the product. The second one is the respective quantity offered at this price, or simply saying equilibrium quantity. What we see at macroeconomic level, of course, there are a lot of similarities, but these similarities actually occur at the first glance because aggregate demand is a little wider than demand at macroeconomic level as well as the aggregate supply. But anyway, the approach is very similar. So in both cases, we have to find the intersection of supply and demand. So in that case, in macroeconomic case, we have to think about the intersection of aggregate demand and aggregate supply, because the result will be equilibrium price level, not price, but equilibrium price level, because we explain demand and supply at the aggregate level at the total quantity of goods and services, not the separate product, not the separate specific service, but the total amount of goods and services offered in the market. Of course, the result is price level, and we call this equilibrium price level. This is not the price of the single product. That's the averaged price level of all goods and services offered in the market. And what about the quantity of output? Probably you see the cat line has two cat lines. The first one, the horizontal, that shows the equilibrium price level, and the second one, that is vertical cat line, shows the respective equilibrium output. Actually, the equilibrium output is the desirable output produced by the whole economy within the single government, and that actually shows the optimal utilization of all resources available at the moment. Okay, that is something new for interpretation of aggregate demand. Please have a look very carefully on this equality, because from the right-hand side of this equality, actually we all are familiar, but what about the left-hand side of this equality? Anybody wants to help me to interpret the right-hand side of this equation? Anybody wants? Please, Akif, could you please to answer my question? Or Leila? Or Aisu? No one wants? Please switch on your microphones and answer my question. Actually, no one wants to. Okay. Wow, Chichak, I see. Raula, and anyone, would you like to help me, because I want to feel your participation, class participation. Okay, no one wants. What to do? So perhaps I have to continue. So C, I, G, and NX. If you remember, so that are the four components of GDP. And but let's think about the GDP and the amount of goods and services produced, and that will be realized if all the goods and services produced and described in like the GDP, gross domestic product, perhaps they will generate some incomes. That's why if we want to convert the real GDP into monetary expression, we actually perhaps have the strong right to assert that at the same time, that is the total income generated by the country. That's why the left-hand side of equality, you may consider like national income received from the gross domestic product produced within the single year. That's why we may, to write this equation and to make equal the amount of national income to the sum of these four components. So that's a major, actually you may assert that these four important components of GDP or national income at the same time contribute to the aggregate demand for goods and services. I would like to remind you, if you remember, C shows the total consumption expenditures, including everything, tangible, the products, durable, non-durable, and services. I, or that's more correct probably to write IG, it means gross private domestic investment. G, that's a government purchases. And the final XN is net export, or the difference between the amount of export and the import of the country. Now move further. Okay, so let's a little bit think about the properties of aggregate demand with a little bit more detailed analysis. So I would like to offer. Look, again, we see, by the way, in macroeconomics, when we want to construct the aggregate demand curve, of course, we have clearly understand that the vertical axis is not just the price of the separate goods, single goods or services. That's a different price level, right? So it may be a little bit lower or higher. The price level we know may change in economy. As minimum, we're familiar with inflation processes, right? And you know what is inflation. As a result of inflation, when the prices majorly go up, the price level may change from P2, say on the picture you see that, to P1, or vice versa, because of deflation. If inflation is increase in the price level of all goods and services, deflation is slightly opposite procedure. It means significant decline in the prices of goods and services. But look, the price level may change, and that's our vertical axis. The horizontal axis shows the quantity of output. I would like to clarify this term quantity of output because you have to ask me, okay, what kind of output? So in general, we imply that the horizontal axis shows the amount of real GDP. So when we say quantity of output, we imply real GDP. Okay, now let's analyze the slope of aggregate demand. As you can see, the slope of aggregate demand is slightly downward. What's the reason? Why is going on like that? Look, if price level is fixed at P1, we have the respective quantity of output denoted by Y1. And now imagine that the price level slightly decreased and the new price level at the P2. So what do we observe? We see significant increase in quantity of goods and services demanded. Is it normal? Yes, it is, because no matter as at the macroeconomic level or macroeconomic level, the general trend is stable. And normally when the prices, even the price level of different goods and services slightly goes down, it means that increase in real output, in amount of goods and services demanded is expected to go up. So that we see this on the scheme, and this movement from Y1 to Y2 proves our proposals. Okay, now let me go to the next slide. Okay, so actually I explained that the slope of aggregate demand curve is downward. But now we want to summarize one of the reasons why the aggregate demand curve is downward sloping. So there are several effects that very sharply may change the aggregate demand, because these factors or these effects, economic effects, they can influence the aggregate demand. The first one is price level and consumption. Well, in macroeconomics, it's known like wealth effect. So how we have to understand wealth effect? Wealth means the savings, the amount of savings of the population. To simplify the understanding of this effect, I would like to use an example. Well, what do you think? Why the leading countries, I mean the economically developed countries like United Kingdom or European countries, and basically United Kingdom is a very bright example, and the United States of America. Well, the amount of wealth in these countries is incomparably huge with the amount of wealth in the rest of the world. There are a lot of reasons. But firstly, not say historical reasons, because historically, United Kingdom was a great empire, and very often the citizens of the UK, they benefit from the resources of the other countries that they controlled, the countries that were the parts of the very great empire. Well, unfortunately, I don't know, unfortunately or fortunately, the other countries didn't have such a kind of prosperous opportunities. Okay, so the higher the wealth of population, the more reliable, the more I don't know, the more strong actually is their belief in the future, because they have savings, they have specific financial support. Even the economic fluctuations may go not so positive direction. The other effect is so-called interest rate effect, and wealth effect basically controls the price level and consumption in the country. The interest rates is more closer to the price level and investment. And the third effect, known like exchange rate effect, implies the interactions of the price level available in the country and the amount of net export of the country. Look, there are three important effects that may direct the behavior of aggregate demand. Well, now I see that I have several minutes before end of my first part of the lesson. So actually, I offer you to analyze in more details each effect, because all these effects may change the position of aggregate demand curve, the shifts of aggregate demand. Okay, so the price level and consumption and the wealth effect. So we have to understand the interactions of wealth effect with price level. Normally, when the price level goes down, decreases, the situation frequently forces customers and the consumers feel themselves more wealthy, because everything is going well in their life. Price level goes down, but they have wealth and they have savings. That's why they don't worry. And under these economic circumstances, the majority of consumers in the country may think about more spending. So this situation encourages majority of customers to spend more. That's very interesting outcome of wealth effect when the price level goes down. And what happens in turn? Increase in consumer spending unavoidably leads to more and more quantities of goods and services demanded. So if I'm quiet because I'm wealthy, I don't worry about the situation because the situation is very good for me. The price level goes down, so I can spend more and I can buy expensive goods. So I don't need to save every cent, every dollar, you know. So every normal customer thinks like that, and in turn, totally, the demand for goods and services goes up because the customers spend more and they need larger and larger quantities of goods and services demanded. Okay. If you have any questions, please immediately put me questions. And otherwise, I need to move further. Okay. A lower, what about the lower price levels? You know, if we discuss the effect of decline in price level and the interaction with wealth effect, the other one is interest rate effect. Actually, when we say interest rate, we imply the interest rates offered by banks for both, for credits and for deposits as well. So when the price level declines, goes down, simply saying, it leads to step-by-step reduction of the interest rates. And this in turn encourages more spending, of course, not only on consumer goods, but on investment goods as well. Because not only consumers spend their money, but entrepreneurs, firms also behave like consumers, and but they spend their money on investment goods. They may decide to buy more new technical tools, I don't know, different equipment, machinery, etc. So, but what happens in terms of increased spending, investment spending, simply saying? It means that now, again, we need larger quantity of goods and services demanded. Okay. So the third effect, the price level and net exports, how can they interact? How can they affect each other? And to understand these interactions better, we need to understand the exchange rate effect. Okay. For example, we very frequently discuss the practice of the United States because that's the leading economy of the world. And this fact, unfortunately, is not always positive. Sometimes this fact brings some negative outcomes. Well, like right now. So when imagine that the price level in the United States economy slightly falls down, so and this situation causes the interest rates offered by the US banks to fall. So as a result of this situation, real exchange rate will depreciate, and in turn, this fact will stimulate the United States net exports. sorry. Okay, so again, increase in net export spending always requires more goods and services demanded. Okay, so this question, the second question, is the reasons that may cause demand curve to shift, no matter what direction. But we have to understand why this procedure is going on. Well, actually, if you don't mind, I would like to stop the lesson at the moment because I need some break because of my voice. If you have the questions, please put my questions. I'll be happy to answer. Okay. I hear to your I very carefully listen to your questions. And the participants, I want to. Okay. So, any questions? No questions. That's great. It means that you understood everything, or you understood nothing. Okay, so let's talk about the other technical moments. Would you like to put my questions about your exam tests or something else? I promised you to solve your examination test, so probably I'll do this today in the evening. Well, I have 1 minute. Well, if you know the date of your exam, so the exam for your group is planned for the 8th of June. So this is for active students, for the students who always participated in my class. So I would like to put the question to Akif, but unfortunately I don't see him. What's going on? I don't know. Okay, so the first part of the students in your group will take exam on 8th